Welcome to Contrarian Humanitarian, your blog and podcast for all things international development, analyzing global injustices and building solutions for a better world.
Hey, y'all. Welcome to the first episode of Contrarian Humanitarian, featuring your host, Aaron Edmiston, who is not in the chat room yet, but I am here. Have no fear.
Okay. All right. So what I said on mute is just thanking Mikey so much for being our master producer and trying to get this together. We did do some test runs for audio. Not sure what's happening this morning, but please bear with us. And like I said, we're so excited to do this. This is our inaugural Contrarian Humanitarian podcast. Thank you so much for all of the support that you've already given us with our 2 episodes we've released for our pilot podcast series where I interview Mikey. But today we're going to interview guests other than ourselves. We have 2 esteemed economists joining us to talk about economic and monetary sovereignty, particularly for Africa, and we're going to get in how that parallels with development and humanitarian assistance. Is this good?
Yeah, you're fine.
All right. So a little bit about Contrarian Humanitarian. If you haven't heard about us, we are a new blog and podcast. You can find us on contrarianhumanitarian.org. And the reason it's a .org is because right now, we're trying to do more blogs and podcasts, but ultimately we want to organize and bring people together and to create a community of humanitarians and humanitarian allies and people that are willing to call out global injustices in these sectors and are also looking to find solutions and how we can come together to mobilize and produce change. So essentially, we're all about people over profit. I myself have been in the humanitarian international development sector for almost a decade, and through my various ventures have realized there's a lot wrong with the sector, which I just find incredibly ironic considering, most people have the best of intentions when they get in and don't realize, I'm myself included, didn't realize the larger systems that were at play in our work. And I think to be good humanitarians, we need to do things contrarian to what is currently being done in the mainstream. And so we're here to shed light on these global injustices in the humanitarian and international development sector. And again, look for solutions, which is why we have Dr. Fadhel Kaboub on today and Dr. Ndongo Samba Sylla, 2 amazing economists specializing in modern monetary theory, MMT, which you'll hear all about. And this could be a game-changing solution for how countries can become sovereign and control their own economic flow, monetary flow, and more types of sovereignty, which we'll get into. And this is but this is incredibly important because essentially humanitarian efforts are in response to lack of sovereignty oftentimes. And so we want to ensure to allow countries to have sovereignty. So there is less need for cyclical and perpetual humanitarian and neo-colonial assistance all over the world. So that's what we're here broadly discussing. And I think we can bring in our first guest. I am so excited. You probably already know him. Now that I follow him, he's all over the place spreading the message. And I'm so honored and we're privileged to have Dr. Fadhel Kaboub joining us. Hello.
Good morning. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, thank you so much. I can't thank you enough for taking a chance on both of us on this podcast, considering you're our first guest and really kicking this off for us. So thank you so much for giving us a chance. To it. Yeah. Can you hear this?
No, I won't be able to hear.
So okay. Can you turn up your mic just a touch?
I can turn his mic.
Or Mikey can turn up your mic.
Yeah, I have no controls on this side.
I can't turn his up.
Oh, interesting.
I don't see any adjustments, but
We can turn ours down.
I can go louder.
Can you go a touch louder?
Maybe bring the mic closer up here. Is this better?
Yes, that's better.
Okay, good.
Yeah, great. Awesome. Okay, can you X out that?
Yep.
Thanks.
Okay.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. How are you? How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm on the East Coast, so it's too early your time, but it's reasonable my time.
Nice. Okay. So I think to get started, because, we want to get into your personal stories and we're going to ask some personal questions and how you are doing what you're doing, why you're doing what you're doing. But obviously, we're going to talk about some technical things as well. So if you could kind of give us a breakdown, a little economic theory 101, kind of set the stage for kind of the typical modes of thinking for economic thought, and how MMT differs from that, and what MMT can bring. So just sort of a very basic lay understanding of the land so we can kind of get our terms.
So most of the issues that our listeners and viewers will be interested in have to do with the capacity of a national government to address national priorities. And that would include, public health, education, a response to the pandemic or any, climate crisis, ecological crisis. It's how do we pay for this intervention? And the traditional view tells us that government spending is limited by the tax revenues that the government can bring in, and potentially also with the borrowing capacity of the government. So this is how much we can tax. This is how much we can borrow. So that's the spending capacity of the government. And beyond that, it's irresponsible for governments to go beyond that, because it will cause inflation, even hyperinflation, which will hurt the economy and hurt the people even more. Well, MMT steps in and says, well, wait a minute. The borrowing capacity and the taxing capacity of the government is not the real constraint. The overall spending capacity of the government is much, much larger than that. It's not unlimited, but it's constrained by the risk of inflation, potential risk of inflation. And then MMT says the risk of inflation is determined by two things. One is the productive capacity of the economy. In other words, do we have the people, the skills, the materials, the technology to produce? If we can, then there is no risk of inflation. If we don't, then we have to think about building up productive capacity. That's the good thing about productive capacity. It's producible. We can train more people, we can build more hospitals, and so on. The second risk of inflation is something that MMT emphasizes, which is market power. When you have powerful key players who can raise prices and cause inflation simply because they can, because they have too much market power. And that type of inflation can't be eliminated with austerity, with not spending on priorities. It can only be eliminated by taxing and regulating that market power out of existence. So that's where MMT gets political, in a sense, where it puts the burden on transparent democratic institutions to do their job, to expand the spending capacity of the government, as opposed to the current system where you have key institutions that actually suffocate the spending capacity of the government, and as a result, throw people under the bus, so to speak. So that's kind of overall where we can start the conversation.
Yeah, and I'll just say, in America, the typical United States, the typical trope is that, yes, if you want better schools, if you want better infrastructure, you need to pay more in taxes. And so some people are willing and can pay more in taxes, and some people are not willing. And I in part understand not willing to pay taxes, because what we see often is even when we pay more taxes, what we get out of it is not what we wanted. It's still not sufficient for what income we have, paying more percentage to the government of that and still not seeing the results. And so could you talk a little bit about what inflation is? Because that comes up a lot, and that's sort of, I think, often an economist's term to scare people into other ideas like MMT. So what is inflation? Could you expand upon that more, and what does that mean?
So inflation means different things to different people. Primarily, it means different things to you and I and my neighbors versus to professional economists and policymakers. So for policymakers, the thing they refer to when they talk about inflation, it's not the cost of living that you and I experience on a monthly basis. They're referring to an index. It's called Consumer Price Index. And you can think of it as the average price level in the economy, which includes, what the Bureau of Labor Statistics does to calculate this average price is they identify the typical American family, and they identify the typical basket of goods that family consumes. So on average, you buy milk and sugar and transportation and clothing and all kinds of things. And they put a price tag on all the items that the family consumes, and they create an index. It's a weighted index based on, how important each item is. And when that index moves up from month to month, we call it inflation. And when it moves down, we call it deflation. So that's the inflation that they talk about in the price index. But the inflation that you and I experience has to do with very specific items within that index that actually put the additional burden on families. So with that average index, there are some items that go up month to month and some items that go down month to month, and they average out to maybe stable inflation, right? And that's what's happening. So when you dig deeper into that inflation index, you realize that in the US in particular, there's 4 key items that are overinflating month to month that if you go to your neighbor now and tell them which items are really burdensome on your spending, they'll immediately identify them without being an economist, without knowing what inflation is. They'll tell you healthcare is expensive, and that's one of the items that's inflating. They tell you real estate or cost of housing is expensive, energy and transportation, and higher education. These are the big inflation items in the US. But when you ask, policymakers, they tell you inflation is low because there's other items that are deflating. All the cheap tech that we import, the assembled plastics that we import from other countries, and so on. So it shows up as an average as 1.8% inflation, which is very low on average. But it doesn't tell you that there are absolutely, burdensome items on families that are overinflating. And that's where MMT comes in, because when you dig into those categories, you realize that this is where the highest market concentration is in the US economy. So we're talking about big pharma, we're talking about big real estate companies, we're talking about oil and gas companies. That's where the market power is.
Yeah, and the sort of confusion or the sort of veil over inflation and saying that we sort of have stable inflation because it's kind of evening out, sort of makes me think of where we are overall in terms of global poverty. We're really, when you take an average, you're really looking at 2 very distinct populations. What we're seeing more and more is more people, clustered at the bottom and more people clustered at the top. So when you average, you're talking about almost nobody that's living in that middle. So these things can be very deceiving, as you were saying, with inflation. And so MMT turns it on its head. And how does it get around these inflationary ideas?
Well, MMT turns a lot of things on their heads, starting with the very logic of government spending and taxation. So if we agree that sovereign governments issue their own currency and that it's counterfeit for any other entity to do that, then as a matter of logic, in order for us, the consumers, the citizens, to pay taxes, that money must come from somewhere, and it only comes from the federal government and its agents, which means, as a matter of logic, government spending comes first, tax revenues come later. So we can't even use the phrase taxpayers' money. It's public money, meaning it's issued by the government. So there's a confusion here that MMT identifies, which is at the state and local level, it's true that we pay taxes so that we can have roads and schools and hospitals and so on at the city and state level. So cities, municipalities, your local state, they are just like you and I, they're currency users. They're users of the dollar. They can't issue it into existence. But at the federal level or at the national level in any country, we can't use the concept of taxpayers' money because it's illogical. It's just a matter of logic. You can't pay taxes denominated in a unit that doesn't exist yet. That unit has to come into existence, and the only way for it to come into existence is for the national government to issue it. So this means that by definition, the national government, the federal government, has to run budget deficits so that the rest of us, users of that,
so we can make it up,
can accumulate some of it, can use it, can save it. It doesn't say anything about distribution of wealth and so on, but as a matter of logic, it must be abundant so that the rest of us can use it, save it, and then use some of it to pay taxes.
right? And so, you talked about the federal government. Can you talk, because I think this is going to be a huge central theme to this conversation, could you talk about central banking and specifically what central banking is and exactly, again, how this plays out in the economic policy that we have today and what MMT is saying we can do with the central banks? So
one of the things that MMT also, introduces to the public policy conversation is the fact that the central bank is part of the government. A lot of economists for decades now have insisted that central banks need to be independent from the government. And this is true now, globally, not just in the US. There's almost like as part of the structural adjustment policies that the IMF is imposing on developing countries. Now there's increasingly a demand that parliaments around the world pass laws to enforce central bank independence so that they don't finance government spending, because they see it as, this is the entity that can print money and allow the government to borrow excessive amounts. And I'm bringing this up right now because Tunisia right now, my home country, is going through an economic crisis, just like most developing countries because of the pandemic. And the government is unable to pay its employees basic salaries and so on, or provide economic relief. So they turn to the central bank to lend money to the national government, to the Ministry of Finance, essentially, to spend. And the governor of the central bank turns around and said, sorry, there's a law on the book that says I can't. And when you go back and you realize that was the law that was introduced by the Tunisian parliament following the demand of the IMF after the uprisings in Tunisia and the transition to democracy. Tunisia was borrowing money from the IMF, and one of the conditions was to pass this law that says the central bank must remain independent and can't finance government deficits. In other words, the government of Tunisia now is forced to go to private markets to borrow at much, much higher interest rates if funds are available to begin with, which means more conditionality. So now the last resort is going to be the IMF, yet another loan from the IMF, and now the IMF will reinforce structural adjustment policies, which will say, well, the government, you need to privatize some of your, inefficient entities. Why don't you sell the airport? Why don't you sell the water company? Why don't you sell more government resources to foreign investors so you can generate dollar revenues to pay for the debt that you have? So this is a long way of saying that this concept of central bank independence is very vicious. It's designed to weaken national governments and to give more influence and power and dominance to private sector entities in order to invade what would normally be the public domain and sovereign government policies. And most people sort of don't feel this, the viciousness of this approach during normal economic times. But when we hit a crisis like this, it becomes clear as daylight that this is a hijacking of public resources by the private sector, and in this case, by neo-colonial private entities.
Sorry, hold on just 1 second.
You had the YouTube link open, so that's why you're hearing like a 30-second delay on everything. So you should be good to go back to your station.
Okay. Mikey and his producer genius, I think, figure it out. So I'm going to go back to my station so we can both man
each
this.
other
But hold
well.
on a second. Hold on
Sure.
to the IMF thought process, because I have some questions. Or after I said them. Okay, so the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and this was created after World War II. It's one of the Bretton Woods institutions, as we say. So a lot of international institutions were created after World War II. And could you explain, exactly what the IMF is, and why the IMF has the power to create laws in Tunisia that would prohibit them from, getting the money they need to create the resources and services they need to, help their people, help their citizens?
Yeah. Well, the IMF doesn't have the right to create laws. They just say, we have $3 billion worth of loans for the government of Tunisia. We will not disperse those loans until you pass that law. So it's blackmailing.
Legal
But
blackmailing.
as a sovereign government, if you have no other option, or if you believe you have no other option, then you're going to have to do it eventually. And the Tunisian government resisted this for a while, but then didn't have any other option because inflation was skyrocketing and there was food protests and things like that. So they eventually passed it. But to go back to your question, the IMF was created at the Bretton Woods Conference, which was the international conference to restructure the global financial system after World War II. And it was, 1945, there were no developing countries, right? They were all colonies, essentially. Mm-hmm. So it was really the global superpowers, the US and the UK in particular, meeting to rearrange the global financial system. And the main purpose was to avoid the crises that happened in between the two wars that some economists and some politicians at the time believed actually partly led to World War II. And that's the interwar beggar the neighbor policies, which essentially meant that there were European countries who were artificially devaluing their currency relative to the value of gold in order to make their exports cheaper. So it was a currency war. So if I'm France and I make my currency relatively cheaper than the Italian lira, then everything I export from France to Italy will become relatively cheaper. So Italian consumers will buy more of my stuff. And that means I generate a trade surplus against Italy. So now Italy has to give me gold. So now France has more gold. But of course, Italy can do the same. They can retaliate by also devaluating their currency. And they reverse the flow. And as they do this, Belgium will do the same, the UK will do the same, Germany will do the same. So it was a constant currency war cycle that was happening in Europe that essentially completely destroyed and destabilized economic activity. Because if I'm an exporter and I'm an importer, I can't make plans not knowing what the value of my exports are going to be. So it was extremely destabilizing. So the idea here was to avoid that competitive or currency devaluation, currency wars in a new world, so that when a country has a trade deficit, it doesn't have to resort to attacking its neighbors economically, but instead it goes to the IMF as a lender of last resort and be able to restructure and stabilize its economy in an orderly manner without having to destabilize the whole world, right? So that was the role of the IMF, is to be the emergency room for countries in crises related to their trade balance, for example. The World Bank was also created at the same conference, but for a different purpose. So think of the IMF as a short-term lender, kind of crisis situation. The World Bank is more of a long-term economic development lender. And initially it was created not for the purpose of developing the developing world, because the developing world were colonies essentially, but it was primarily created to rebuild Europe, to help the rebuilding of Europe. But by the time you get to the late 60s, early 70s, Europe is rebuilt and the World Bank is repurposed to meet the needs of the newly independent developing countries. So it became sort of your development bank. with its sort of mission changing every 10-year cycle with a new priority. Sometimes it's infrastructure, sometimes it's education, sometimes it's dealing with HIV/AIDS, sometimes it's dealing with climate change. So it's you see the kind of the focus of the World Bank shifting from time period to time period.
Right.
But it's really starting in the 80s that both the World Bank and the IMF started, shifting to the structural adjustment policies that moved away from the national government having a role to play in economic development and into this new vision that says the private sector should be leader in economic development. So it's the whole privatizing the economy and balancing budgets and imposing austerity policies. So this is kind of, a brief overview of why those institutions exist and what they do to this day. A final note, because not a lot of people recognize this, and this is the role of the US in both institutions. So a lot of people think these are international institutions. They're technically institutions of the United Nations, but they're like the rich kids of the UN. And they don't follow the same rules of other UN organizations like UNDP or UNEP. So it's not one country, one vote. It's, the IMF and the World Bank are structured based on different levels of voting power. The US holds about 16 or 17% of the shares of the IMF, for example, which means it has 17.5% of the votes. But the decisions are structured so that no decision can be made unless it has 85% of the votes, which means if the US votes no, you don't get the 85%. So essentially the US has veto power within those organizations, which means the US essentially designs the structural adjustment policies that we have in the world today. So it's extremely influential from a US foreign policy perspective. So if you're not friends with the US, if you don't follow the rules, not only will you not get access to the IMF and the World Bank resources, but you'll also get the wrath of the US from a geopolitical and economic perspective. Which these days, a lot of countries are actually trying to avoid going to the IMF because they know how bad it is.
Right. Well, when the IMF, like you said, was created for, short-term assistance, and Tunisia is trying to, receive assistance for this type of thing, during the pandemic, and isn't able to do so, I would say we have a problem. We could talk, and I definitely want to call out how heinous America is in these global institutions. But we have our second guest on, everybody, Dr. Ndongo Samba Sylla. He's okay. Sorry, yes, he's here, and he's coming on. There you are. Hello.
Hello, Erin. Hello, Fadhel. How are you?
Good morning. How are you today, Ndongo?
Yeah, I'm fine. Glad to be here with you.
Thank you so much. I told this to Fadhel earlier. I appreciate you guys so much for taking a chance on us. This is our first podcast, and you guys, do so much speaking engagements and are running around, and so I just can't thank you both enough for believing in us and taking a chance to do this. So, but I'd love to know a little personal story time. How did you guys meet? Because you guys have done a few things together, and so what's the origin?
I remember the first time we met online through friends first, and Ndongo works with Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Dakar, and a common friend works at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Tunisia. So that's how we met initially, through online conversations, and then we started working on this African Economic and Monetary Sovereignty project, which started as a conference, which we had in Tunisia in 2019, and then a book project, which we're working on right now, and then hopefully a follow-up conference as soon as the pandemic is under control planned in Dakar as soon as we have, this pandemic under control. But then when the pandemic started, we, put together this open letter that many people have signed and seen. And so since then, we've been collaborating on all kinds of projects, including a number of podcasts that we've teamed up on.
I know you guys are the dynamic duo. So talking about African sovereignty, that's going to be one of our main discussions today. So, we've been diving into econ basics, some MMT, and so, we've already been talking about Tunisia and what's going on there. And so, how does MMT fit into African sovereignty and sovereignty in general? If you can just, and Ndongo, if you want to take that that line of logic, how we get to economic sovereignty through MMT.
Yeah. Thanks first for the invitation. Really glad to be here and with my friend Fadhel and you, and to talk about all these important issues. I first heard about MMT, I think 3 years ago, through our common friend, Maha Benkada, who is my colleague at the RLS. And at that time, I was working on a book about the CFA franc. CFA franc is a single currency shared by 14 African countries. And I heard from my colleague that there's an approach named MMT, which deals with monetary sovereignty. I say that is interesting because normally you would not find such a kind of approach advocating the need for monetary sovereignty. And when I sat to study this literature, I said these are really an amazing approach, and there are many things we could learn, and also we have tools which help us understand better what is wrong with the non-sovereign currencies we have in most of the global south. Sometimes you could hear the argument that, MMT is for developed countries or for the United States because the United States have the most important international reserve currency. But if you look at MMT is constituted of many parts. In fact, it's a whole, but the whole is made up of parts. You have many different theoretical pillars. For example, you have the idea of chattelism. Chattelism is a theory saying that money is a legal creature, it's an instrument of a state. So, I don't hear you.
Mute. Okay,
go ahead.
Sorry for some. Sorry. Just clarifying the first theoretical pillar. What did you say it was called? Shackleism?
Capitalism, yes. Capitalism.
Okay.
Yeah. It's
Chartalism.
Yeah.
Wait.
Chartalism.
Chartalism. Got it. Thank you.
It's an approach saying that money is a legal creature and it's a creature of the state. And money is also the instrument of a state. When you are sovereign state, you need to issue your own currency. But contrary to what most people think, before the sovereign state receives its, let's say, tax income, the sovereign state has to spend first, you see. So this is a really important argument. In my own research about the CFA franc, about French monetary colonialism, you see all the capitalist principles. Because what did the colonial powers do, the European colonial powers? The first thing they said, we are going to prohibit your indigenous currencies. In West Africa, there is a well-known currency, the cowries. It was used throughout West Africa. And these cowries were imported from the Indian Ocean. So the first thing they did, we stopped the importation of the cowries. And now we prohibit also the payment of taxes in cowries. Populations have to pay taxes in the new currency, in the new colonial currency. The purpose of the tax was not to fund the colonial administration, but to create a demand for the colonial currency. Because before paying the taxes, the colonial administration has to spend first its currency. So by spending its currency, the colonial powers could organize, in a way, the colonial economy in the way that was desirable for their objectives. So this is a really powerful principle, and you could see it in action when you study the history of monetary colonialism. That's why when people say, you cannot apply MMT, it's nonsense, because capitalism is the best approach when you have to understand the fiscal and monetary dimension of colonialism. There is another theoretical pillar, is what is called the sectoral balance approach, meaning that when you look at the whole economy, you could distinguish three broad sectors. You have the government sector, you have the private sector, that means households and businesses, and you have the external sector, that means trade relationships and financial relationships. And when you sum up all the financial balances of the three sectors, it's always zero. It's always zero, meaning that for every debit you have a credit. For every spending is also an income for another economic agent. So that's why it's always zero. And during the colonial economy, the colonial administrations were functioning on what is called sound finance principles. That means the budgets are balanced. The fiscal income is balanced with the spending of the colonial government. That means there is a zero, let's say, the financial balance of zero. Let's say 0 franc at that time. And so that means that the colonial government did not create net financial wealth for the private sector, because the only way the government can create net financial wealth for the private sector is for the government to incur a deficit. That means, for example, the government spend much more than it taxes its economy. But that was not the case, because there was this sound financial principle saying that the colonies have to be self-sufficient. That means all the spending, military spending, infrastructure spending, and current expenditures had to be financed by taxes. That means that the government didn't create anything for the local economy. So the only way the private sector could accumulate financial wealth was through exports, net exports. That means that the economy had to export much more than it imports. So that means diminishing the standard of living of the colony, because imports are a good thing, and normally they diminish the imports, and they are just funding, let's say, projects which would boost exports, let's say in the commodity sector, agricultural products and mining products. And as though the prices of those products are really volatile, that means they are changing one year to another. And so that means that those economies were really volatile. And as also the external trade sector was controlled by the metropolitan capital, that means that all the, let's say, net exports, all the net exports revenues were going just to be controlled by the metropolitan capital. And you see through MMT that the lack of public deficit mean that there are a lot of other real deficits, low investment in education, low investment in health sector, low education in, let's say, the productive sectors, etc., low investment, for example, in food security, etc., food sovereignty. So those are principles you could see by using MMT tools. And when you use MMT tools, you apply them to the colonial situation, you could understand now why colonialism could not bring development, because there were no deficits and all the economies were oriented just for extraction. And there are many, many other things you could find using MMT. For example, all the historians of, let's say, the colonial period, when they speak about taxes, they don't precise in which currency taxes were in which currencies taxes were
paid in.
Yeah, and for me, if they have this MMT lens, they could have a better sense of what colonialism was in the fiscal domain. So there are many, many things you could do with MMT. For me, MMT is an untapped potential for the developing countries. So when people say MMT could not be applied developing countries, I am from a developing country. You have to let us speak our own opinion about MMT before you are having a dictate about MMT.
Right, right. I think you hit the nail on the head with this discussion of the history of the economic and monetary changes in Africa, and we see, and this is something I'm hoping you both can expand on, is because, the reason I said this in the intro is that one of the reasons I wanted to have economists on is because what you're talking about, economic sovereignty essentially would dismantle the international development or humanitarian systems as we know it, because then we wouldn't need so much humanitarian international aid if every country was self-sufficient. And what I also find interesting, if you guys, I'd love to hear your personal stories about, and Ndongo, you kind of shared this last time we talked about, personal frustrations with MMT and trying to share this message, and because it is so game changing. And I got an international or master's of international development policy, right? I took 2 econ courses and didn't do very well in them, didn't understand, but in my head I just kept thinking like, okay, there's a lot of money in this world and there's a lot of need, but we have all of these crazy contraptions and words, legalese, and these things that I can't really wrap my head around, and it makes it confusing for the person. But really what you guys are breaking down is that, a lot of what economists talk about is smoke and mirrors. And there is something like MMT that can totally, as we keep saying, but it's a game changer and allowing countries to have economic sovereignty. But I'd love if you guys want to share any personal stories of your own, your own stories of kind of coming up against some sort of like persecution for this style, or in academia, out of academia, what things have people told you, or Fadhel, go ahead.
I can go ahead. Yeah. So there's a few observations to add to Ndongo's beautiful description of the MMT lens and its importance, and it has to do with the origins of colonialism. There's this idea that there's all of these poor countries and rich, developed countries are going there to develop, and which is nonsense. I mean, why would if developing countries were poor, why would rich countries go to them? Colonialism happened because developing countries were extremely wealthy, and they wanted to extract wealth from them.
Exactly.
So number one, these are rich countries that happen to have poor people and happen to be weaker relative to the political and military power of the West. So that's something to remember, and that is present to this day. Developing countries are still rich, and they still have poor people, and that's why the neo-colonial extraction continues to this day.
Exactly, yeah.
And the economics profession, from the beginning, from the colonial times to this day, has been used as an analytical tool, as a scientific, quote-unquote, pseudo-scientific tool to justify that extraction and to justify the abuse. There's no doubt about it. Anybody who tries to tell you otherwise is a gatekeeper for the elites, for the establishment. So let's recognize these things from the beginning. It doesn't mean that every professional economist is doing this intentionally. I'm saying they're doing this by training. They've been trained to do this. And in many cases, they don't see any other alternative, which means that they will resist any other alternative explanation because they truly believe they're doing science, right? Some professional economists know what they're doing, and those need to be called out. But why is it that the rest of the profession doesn't even know that they're participating in this abusive, extractive, neo-colonial system at the international level, but also domestically? The same abuse happens domestically and is, again, justified by professional economists through pseudo-scientific tools and so on. It's because over time, the economics profession has intentionally eliminated from the curriculum key areas and key courses where economists or students would be exposed to alternative ways of thinking. So MMT economists are not sort of new at this. This has been done to Marxist and feminist and institutionalist and anybody who believes in a different way of thinking about the system, analyzing the system, including ecological economists and others. So number one, it's not new. So all of those ideas, alternative ideas about thinking about economics, used to be taught in a course known as History of Economic Thought. The history of economic ideas, how ideas developed and how they evolved, and what are the debates and contradictions between different approaches. And that's the course where troublemakers used to be trained because they're exposed to a new idea, and then they go to their macro course, they go to their micro course, they go to their international development course, and they start bringing these critiques from different perspectives. And that creates trouble, good trouble, I would say, for professors who are teaching in that area, or for development agencies who are part of this global neocolonial extractive mode. And if you're a young economist joining one of those agencies and saying, why are we doing this way? Then you're not part of the system. So it started with, major universities in the US in particular, eliminating that course from their curriculum completely, which means as a young academic, student, PhD, you go through a training program that's been biased towards one particular approach, and that's neoclassical economics. And that's the mainstream approach that dominates professional journals and hirings and grants and all kinds of, the entire ecosystem of the economics profession is dominated by one approach. And that's the approach that dominates the World Bank and the IMF approach and so on. And that just so happens that it's the approach that is very much pro-business. So no wonder that the Koch brothers would spend hundreds of millions of dollars to support think tanks and grants and contributions to universities to promote that particular approach, and to promote politicians who embrace that particular approach in the US and around the world. So when you think of the Cato Institute, when you think of the Heritage Foundation, when you think of the American Enterprise Institute and beyond, and all the PR money that's going to towards promoting these ideas, then you understand that if you're a professional economist and coming from an alternative perspective, you may not even get a job. You may not get your work published in mainstream journals. You will not get research grants, which means you're not part of the establishment mainstream approach. And that's something that we see around the world. I mean, when I studied in Tunisia, I studied economics, and one of the textbooks that we used was a French translation of Krugman's classic textbook, right? So, and it was translated, and I remember the sticker in the back of the book was printed with funds from UNDP, if I'm not mistaken. Which means, once you have the dominant school of thought with all the Nobel laureates producing those ideas and textbooks from a mainstream perspective, it gets translated into every other language. It gets introduced into the curriculum in every developing country. And then the conditional loans that are imposed on developing countries also carry the entire public policy perspective that comes from that approach. So that's the monster that we're talking about. That's how powerful, how dominant it is. And it has nothing to do with the intentions of individual colleagues who went through that system. In many cases, they just have no other way of tackling this entire, ecosystem without having the tools or the training to do so. And I see this quite often, especially in the global South, with young economists who have been trained through this colonial system and have no exposure to alternative ideas, but they live in a society and an economy that experiences the negative effects of that. And they live this internal tension between what they've been trained and told are the professional ways of dealing with economic reality versus the actual reality they live in. And it leads to a lot of frustration, a lot of confusion. And when the MMT lens is presented, and we've seen this in Tunisia with quite a few of our colleagues who have never been exposed to MMT, they say, this is what we've been looking for this whole time. We've been told that there is no other way other than this, economic pain that we must impose on our people in order to, go through this necessary process of economic development.
Yeah. And I've a lot of comments, but Ndongo, do you have any stories you want to share as well about, you being an outsider economist coming up against this? I can only imagine what you guys have been through, considering, like I said, I just did a master's program and had some questions for my econ professors and felt, befuddled and confused. So that's just, my small experience. But yeah, Ndongo, do you have anything you want to share?
Yeah, I would say that I have been lucky to have some exposure to institutional economists when I was doing my bachelor and the first year of my master, because I was studying at the University of Paris 7 in France, and the teaching of economics was, let's say, somehow neoclassical, but there was an opening to other schools of thought. So I had that luck. But when I started doing my master in development economics, it was neoclassical development economics. But it was unfortunate because before there was, let's say, the neoclassical turn in development economics, let's say there was a heterodox tradition starting from let's say, the Second World War. There were many powerful development economists from the global south, like Raoul Prebisch, like Ishman and other people, the dependency theories, etc. But all those offers, they were not really taught because they were not interesting for our professors. So we just stick to neoclassical development economics. And I was not attracted by neoclassical development economics because the hypothesis was so crazy, and somehow it violated what I lived as someone coming from a developing country. For example, when you have a course on agriculture, microeconomics of agriculture, and the teacher say that the peasants are rational, they know all the set of prices, and each time they make the good choices, etc. They are optimizing, etc. So that could not be convincing because this is not the image I have of the agricultural producers I met in my own country. So what I told myself, yes, I'm going to have my diploma, but I don't believe in such kind of crap. What I have to do, I try to read another type of literature. And I read a lot of epistemology. The epistemology is the philosophy of sciences, because I wanted to understand why such a body of theory could be taught at the university. Because for me, neoclassical economics was just an ideology. It was not a science at all. So if this is sold and taught as a science, why? And so I started to read the likes of Kuhn, the like of Lakatos, Feyerabend, etc. And this was somehow a form of therapy, intellectual therapy for me. And I know how science works. It works within paradigms, and sometimes you have degenerated paradigms, but they are not for science, but for agricultural vision, etc. You could have, let's say, you could be right scientifically, but you could not have all the impact, because if you want to have the impact, you have to go through other, let's say, extra scientific processes. That's what I learned reading the likes of Lakatos, etc. So I started to read everything just to open my mind, but to avoid neoclassical economics. But at the same time, to understand better how it works. And you see, there is a powerful article. I say powerful because it has somehow shaped how the neoclassical economic works. It's an article by Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman is an American right-wing Nobel laureate of economics. He wrote in 1953 an article about the methodology of economics. And he was saying basically that if we have the, let's say, bad assumptions, unrealistic assumptions, that's good science. Because what is of importance to us is just what we could predict as theorists. But the realism of the assumptions, we don't care about. And that's how neoclassical economics works. Whereas the other heterodox traditions, they want to have, let's say, theories which are realistic. For example, MMT is an institutionalist approach and describing the relationship between state and central bank, how the currency system work, how the monetary operations work, etc. But this is not the case of neoclassical economics. And at the same time, neoclassical economics, as Fadhel said, is a really conservative, let's say, form of thinking. Because classical economics was not conservative at all. Classical economics was really progressive because during that time, someone like Adam Smith, he was for, let's say, the free market, but he was highly critical of the old order, the feudal order. Whereas neoclassical economics is just the defense of the 1% of bourgeois economics. And that's why it's not interested in explaining how society works, but rather concealing the power relationships and giving arguments so that we could design economic systems worldwide so that it could work for the holders of wealth, the holders of capital. In the case of developing countries, it's really sad because we are much more fundamentalist in the teaching of economics than, let's say, university in the global north. Because in the global north, heterodox economics is marginalized, but you have some pluralism. You could have, let's say, people having, let's say, chairs, having jobs, teaching heterodox economics. But in Africa, it's really tough. Myself, I do not see having a place at the university because it is totally dominated by the teaching of neoclassical economics. And if you do not, let's say, speak the language of neoclassical economics, if you do not do research work along, let's say, the methodological canons of neoclassical economics, it is as if you're not a serious economist, you see. So it's really difficult. But what is good is that whenever we are in a debate, neoclassical economics and heterodox economics, the people could themselves know where the truth is likely to be.
Yeah. Fadhel, did you have something you want to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what Ndongo described in terms of his frustration as a student in the economics profession is not unusual. And there are hundreds and hundreds of students who find themselves in that situation and end up being told, well, it sounds like you're more interested in sociology. It sounds like you're more interested in something else, and they get pushed out of the profession. I mean, I was told at some point when I was in grad school by professional economists at a conference that what I was presenting at this conference sounds beautiful. It's like poetry, but it's not economics. That was the best compliment I ever received. I know I'm not a poet.
Yeah, right? I feel like poetry.
But to emphasize what Ndongo said, and this is something that I'm discovering about Ndongo now, which is his reading of philosophy of science. And I was telling this the other day to my students. The most important book that I've ever read in my life in grad school was Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And I believe we're undergoing a potential paradigm shift. He coined the term paradigm shift. And what he said is the following. He said, in any scientific field, there's going to be a dominant school of thought, a dominant methodology approach of solving problems. But over time, each one of these dominant paradigms will accumulate these anomalies, these problems that the mainstream approach can't solve. And those anomalies start to pile up over time and then create real problems for that approach. And there's no way that the top scholars in that field will be able to address those anomalies with the traditional tools. So they'll keep dismissing them as anomalies, as there's something wrong with the experiment. So they'll completely ignore them. And it's going to be the younger scholars coming into the field who have no kind of religious affiliation with the school of thought, who will try to experiment with different ways of thinking and different ways of addressing those problems. So they'll move away from the mainstream approach and they'll start solving those puzzles that their professors couldn't. And as they say, one funeral at a time, the profession will shift and there'll be a paradigm shift, meaning that new creative alternative solution will become over time the way that the profession moves forward. And I think MMT is addressing some of these unresolved puzzles within the economics profession. In particular, we started this conversation about inflation and the MMT approach to inflation that the mainstream doesn't really have a solution to. And this is not me saying that they don't have, a valid approach to addressing inflation. This is the mainstream professional economists at central banks around the world who are saying, we have no reliable theory of inflation. And I just posted this link for you here. This is a member of the Federal Reserve Board, a couple of weeks after he finished his term, so he's free to speak his mind. He's literally saying the Fed has no reliable theory of inflation. Translation into plain language, plain English, we have no idea what we're doing. If the Fed's job is to target inflation and address inflation, and this came, 10 years after the global financial crisis, where most central banks, the Fed included, were trying to target inflation at 2%, and they used every trick in the textbook to reach that inflation level, to actually create additional inflation, and they couldn't. Every central bank, the Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank, the Fed, all of them missed their target miserably, and they had no idea how to create inflation, let alone an idea about how to reduce inflation, which is what they've been telling the developing world. The way to reduce inflation is to reduce government spending, is to impose austerity. So this is where they are in the mainstream, and yet they're 100% sure that MMT would be inflationary somehow. They have no theory of inflation. They just know that it can't be MMT, right? So what does MMT say about inflation? It brings in market power. It brings in corruption. It brings in cross-border trafficking in developing countries in particular, which feeds into market power and abusive pricing behavior. And
what is cross-border? Sorry?
Yeah, all of those things are completely outside of the scope of neoclassical economics and the approach to central banking. So there's so many other things that cause inflation that have nothing to do with the jurisdiction of the central bank, for example. So, and you asked about cross-border trafficking and other things. So if you look at developing countries, most of the inflation that happens is actually imported, because you import key commodities like food and gasoline and kerosene and medical equipment and all of these things. So you have global, price setters or global markets who actually determine the price of those commodities. So you, the local central bank in Tunisia, can't really determine the price of oil in the Middle East. You can't determine the price of wheat from the Ukraine, right? You can't determine the price of medical equipment coming from Germany. So you're a price taker. And a lot of these prices are dominated by key countries, in some cases by key global corporations. So most developing countries, what they end up doing, and this is the case of Tunisia and many developing countries, is that you have one government agency or one private entity that has the exclusive license to import wheat or gasoline or medical equipment for the country. So that gives market power to that particular individual. In some countries, you can literally name who that person is. It's usually a very powerful, influential individual. So when gas prices go up because oil prices are increasing because of conflicts in the Middle East or Venezuela or something, naturally the imported gasoline will be more expensive. So local prices will go up by 20% and consumers will just have to pay it. But then when global prices go down, there's no incentive for the local monopolist to actually reduce the gas prices accordingly. They reduce it a little bit, but not by the full amount. So they continuously extract, wealth from the local economy. So then if we have, say, a breakdown in a political system, like in the case of Zimbabwe, right? Then where do people bring gasoline or food from? Well, from across the border. So cross-border trafficking becomes another network that brings in the goods that consumers want, but brings them in with an abusive market power, in some cases with the help of the military or corrupt police across border. So now the milk that you're bringing, the cheese that you're bringing, the rice that you're bringing across border, you're the only one that can actually supply the market with it. So you take advantage and you raise prices. And you're willing to do this because you have literally military power or police power behind you to enforce that price system. So I'm not talking about individual traffickers, crossing border, bringing a bag of rice or something. No, we're talking about a whole network, organized network with police corruption, military corruption, with big retailers who are actually in charge of this. And when in the case of corruption with police or cross-border, military backing up this network of trafficking, if you're challenged at a market power and they happen to have guns, then you have a civil war. Then you have a real conflict. So this is extremely difficult to untangle. And this is not just in Zimbabwe, this is in Tunisia, this is all over the developing world in particular. And when you have areas, hot zones of actual conflict, not just economic breakdown or political breakdown, then you have a serious problem. In the case of Tunisia, it's cross-border trafficking that involves not only goods and services, so to speak, but also financial resources and terrorism, cross-border trafficking, because the guys who traffic, they don't care what they traffic as long as you pay them, right? So this becomes extremely dangerous, extremely destabilizing in the developing world. So if you're the central bank and you see this inflation happening, food inflation happening, what do? You're told from the textbook that you should raise interest rates. Now, how does raising interest rates going to stop the cross-border trafficking and the corruption? It's not doing anything. The only thing it's doing is making the cost of doing business more expensive for people who are trying to build housing, for people who are trying to start businesses, right? So it has nothing to do with it. If you raise interest rate because the Ukraine and Russia raised, wheat prices, how is that going to influence the Ukraine to lower the cost of food? How's that going to influence Saudi Arabia to lower the cost of gasoline? It has nothing to do with it. So MMT says your theory of inflation is completely invalid. It's actually counterproductive. So how do we deal with inflation if it has to do with food imports from the Ukraine? Well, you have to develop a food sovereignty strategy, which means your inflation targeting policy starts with the Ministry of Agriculture, not with the central bank, which means your inflation targeting policy starts with the Ministry of Renewable Energy, right? If you have a renewable energy ministry or strategy, has nothing to do with OPEC prices. It has nothing to do with what the central bank can do. So the best metaphor that we use in the MMT space is central bankers are like the baby sitting in the car seat, in the back car seat, and playing with the toy, like pretending they're driving the car, when they're actually not the driver. I mean, the driver in the driver's seat is the Ukraine or OPEC or cross-border traffickers. They're in charge of inflation. They're in charge of the economy. And that's what economic and monetary sovereignty is about. It's about reclaiming the monetary and economic sovereignty of the state, not by stating a political declaration, say we're sovereign. Well, you have to earn it. You have to work hard to actually reclaim that sovereignty. And that's where investment in renewable energy in particular, investment in food sovereignty in particular, allows you to build that resilience so that you're the one in the driver's seat, not some international institutions or some corrupt individuals within your own country.
Right. So let's get into more about African sovereignty specifically. And but I'd love it to just summarize neoclassical and MMT responses, economic responses. So if you could, both of you could give me sort of a plain answer. So if I'm a Tunisian citizen and I come to you, so if one person could give me a neoclassical response and one person could give me an MMT response, if I'm a Tunisian citizen and say, hey, look, we need medicine, we need vaccine, we need, all of these resources during the pandemic, what are you going to do to provide those to us? So if, Fadhel, you want to do the neoclassical and Ndongo, you want to give a MMT response?
And then somebody's going to take a clip of this and it's going to go viral.
Fadhel has changed.
Yeah, well, I'll give you the neoclassical answer. If you want all of these things for the people of Tunisia or Senegal or any other developing country, well, you're going to have to export more so that you earn more dollars and euros to pay for these things. You're going to have to stabilize your local economy so that tourists come back, so that you have millions of tourists bringing dollars to your economy. You're going to have to make your local domestic investment space attractive to foreign direct investors. So, higher rates of returns, even if artificial, tax cuts for foreign investors, subsidies in terms of cheaper electricity and water and real estate so that foreign investors can buy factories or build factories on the cheap. No labor unions would be great because we want cheap labor. Lower environmental standards, even better. So a race to the bottom type of approach. If you want all of these things and importing food and medicine and so on, you have to open up your economy to more international trade. You have to open up your financial markets, including your banking system, to international investors. So again, make your financial markets more attractive, and export more. So you have to specialize in what you do best. And it just so happens, and what you do best happens to be assembly line manufacturing jobs, kind of low value added manufacturing. So export more, encourage exports. So subsidize exporters, give them exclusive privileges so that they can continue to create jobs and export more. It's very simple.
Well, I definitely think that I could increase tourism during a pandemic for sure. So that, that's a great start.
Digital tourism.
Okay, and then I don't particularly care for that response. So, Ndongo, could you give me a MMT response?
Yeah. I think for MMT, the first point would be, what kind of real resources do you have? And what kind of real resources can you develop? Because MMT, as the MMT economists say, is not ultimately about money, but about real resources mobilization. So, for example, if you could build a plant which could provide you with at least most of the medical equipment, MMT economists will say, yeah, we could fund it using local resources. So the first thing to say is what kind of resources you have. If you have real resources, funding should not be an issue. What is specific to MMT is that MMT in some way blows up the fetishism about money. Because in the developing countries, often it is said that they lack money. And as they lack money, they have to find the money abroad, because they have a low rate of savings. So you cannot fund your own development. Either you need development aid, either you need foreign debt investment, or debt, international debt in foreign currency. MMT does not have such kind of perspective. MMT says that, what are the real resources you have? If you have real resources, you could fund your own development using the resources you have. At least you have even to reorient your own development based on the resources you have. You have enough labor, but maybe the labor is not so qualified. Why not give them a job, so a job guarantee scheme that will help them work, have a good income, and also spend in the economy in a way that will create demand for new enterprises, etc. That's the way MMT, in fact, could be used to think about development issues. It's not about going first about where we can find the money, but having an idea what kind of resources do we have, what kind of resources could we mobilize. So in the current context, what is important is that African countries, countries of the Global South, try to mobilize the type of resources they have. And they could have banking sector, financial sector, which could be designed in a way that will help create, let's say, the credit necessary to fund those activities. There are other things that could be done at the international level, and I think MMT economists are not opposed to that. For example, why not cancel the sovereign debt of African countries, of most countries of the Global South? That would not cost much to developed countries. Why? Because it's non-significant, and developed countries could do that. MMT economists are not opposed to that, and there are other things that could be done. For example, increasing the liquidity, foreign liquidity through the issuance of the IMF's currency, the saldoing rise. There are things that could be done at the international level, but nonetheless, at the national level, there is a domestic space which is usually not really used by developing countries because always they are told that they don't have adequate savings and they need to borrow money abroad. For MMT, you have first to see the domestic resources you have, the real ones, and from there you could build your own development.
Thank you both. Before we, especially since you're talking about debt, and we're about to get into African sovereignty, but I just want to say, from just kind of a lay perspective, hearing both of those responses, hearing both of those answers, Ndongo's makes so much more sense to me, because I just have this sort of belief that, what is true on a micro level is kind of true on a macro level. And I think when you have serious issues, the first thing you need to do is understand what resources you have within yourself. Understanding inventory. When a problem arises, okay, what do I have to deal with this within myself? And I think starting from there, you were saying, what resources do we ourselves have? What can we do to help the citizens, help our country, rather than the neoclassical sort of like, okay, we have to keep pushing out, And when you're already sort of strapped or in a low resource position and you keep giving more of yourself, what are you doing? You're just continually depleting yourself. So just kind of on a surface, understanding MMT just makes so much more sense, because it's like, okay, we have a problem. Let's see what we have to fix it, Okay, so getting into African sovereignty and banks, you brought up banking. We talked about central banking before. Okay, sorry, Mike is talking to me. Our cat is, we have our animals locked away and they're not happy about it. Okay, so yes, African sovereignty. We will put the link to the open letter for is it open letter for African sovereignty? Is that exactly what it's called? Okay, we'll put the link for there so people can read it and sign it. And if you could give overall, what is the letter about? What are you asking for? What are you putting forth? And I think we've kind of laid out the groundwork why it is so important with the history of colonialism and, the undercutting of economic sovereignty in other countries. Sorry, just getting some water. Okay. Sorry, losing my train of thought here. Okay. If we could talk about, yes, if someone wants to explain the open letter for African sovereignty, what you're asking for, what the solutions you see, anything we haven't talked about already, and then we'll go from there.
Well, I can start and Ndongo can add. So essentially the open letter is saying that the pandemic is laying bare a lot of these issues that we've exposed in our conversation today, which is, countries can't rely on foreign direct investment or tourism as the key resource for their economic development. And another factor that we didn't mention is reliance on remittances from workers working abroad, or foreign aid, or any of these things. Because when we shut down the economy, we realize that you're completely isolated and your internal economic infrastructure is not able to produce the healthcare resources you need, the food that you need, the energy resources that you need. So all the work that we've been doing in this space essentially became so obvious, to everybody during the pandemic. So what we're asking is number one, recognizing that the traditional policy responses from the World Bank, the IMF, the mainstream of the profession are actually traps in the long term. If you rely exclusively on tourism, if you rely exclusively on foreign direct investment and exports, you're digging yourself deeper into that trap. So number one, recognizing that the current model doesn't work. Number two, recognizing that a better alternative is actually within reach. Because if we have to invest in food sovereignty, especially sustainable agriculture, that's a strength for the domestic economy, and that builds more resilience. If we're going to invest in renewable energy, that's energy sovereignty, that's also resilience for the local economy, and millions of jobs being created. And you can, at the same time, address the unemployment crisis, the lack of economic sovereignty crisis, but also you address the climate crisis that many developing countries are facing right now. So essentially, it's calling on people to join a global public discourse that allows us to educate, empower, inspire people to create this paradigm shift in the public policy space. And it's not sufficient to convince professional economists or to convince policymakers. We have to bring labor movement, the environmental movements, the grassroots movements, the ecological movement on board with people from all kinds of backgrounds in order to create this new world that is actually within reach.
Thank you. I'll add, we should, part of Contrarian Humanitarian is trying to get humanitarian spaces to be mobilized against this as well. Because like I said, changing economic policies would fundamentally shift how we even think about, humanitarian aid. And, we say we're putting ourselves out of a job, but the industry has been around for a long time and it doesn't seem like it's trying to give up. So, I really think that this is something, we should be spreading everywhere, and humanitarians and international development professionals alike should be knowledgeable about this. And Ndongo, do you have anything you want to add about the letter?
Yeah, I would say that this letter is calling for a paradigm shift in terms of economic policy. Fadhel used this word when he talked about, let's say, the demise of neoclassical economics. Its lack of ability of explaining things. And yeah, in this context, it is important for policymakers to know that there are other kind of approaches. And the standard recipes that, let's say, the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization have been pushing forward, those recipes do not work. Do not work because their ultimate result is to create more debt, is to compromise food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and to not create decent jobs for the majority. So we are saying that when we look at things through the lens of monetary sovereignty, economic and monetary sovereignty, there are alternative types of policies we could implement which could be beneficial for the majority. And at the same time, it's a proposal which is internationalist. That means that we are not advocating isolationism, autarky, but we could build a decent, let's say, economic policies for each nation in a way that is coordinated and beneficial to all. For example, we are not advocating that we have to be trade wars or shut up completely from the global economy. But there are other mechanisms different from what is being pushed forward by the dominant institutions, and that could be applied. For example, we are saying that it's possible to put in place a job guarantee scheme that would help people escape from poverty, for example. It is possible that everybody could have access to social protection, food sovereignty, and energy sovereignty. Those are objectives which could be reached by African countries because they have resources. So the argument that they lack money, this is something we dismiss. We could not say that we could not develop or we could not have such kind of project because we lack money. That is a non-issue. The most fundamental issue is what kind of development model we have given, let's say, the ecological constraints we are all facing. So this paradigm shift is really necessary, and that has been the point of our letter. And Fadhel, through his work, fantastic work, is pushing this line of thought, and we are seeing that people are adhering to such kind of vision. Because when you say to people that what is money and how the monetary system works, often you create, let's say, a new horizon for people, a new horizon of struggles, a new horizon of hopes, because people know that if they organize the economy differently, there are many good things that could happen. And when we talk about economic and monetary sovereignty, we are talking from a democratic perspective. That means from a people ordinary people-centered perspective. That means the economy has to be shaped in order to benefit the ordinary people or whatever their location. That has been the purpose of this letter, which has been signed not only by African academics, activists, but many people around the world, economists who are really well known in the US, in Australia, Canada, etc. So this was really, let's say, an internationalist manifesto.
And to add to Ndongo's point about that this is not about the lack of money, it's about the real resources. A point that I made earlier is that the global South is very rich, and the global North, through colonial and neocolonial policies, has been extracting wealth. If we look today at divide the world into global North and global South, rich and poor countries, and net out all the financial transactions for exports and imports and foreign direct investment, humanitarian aid, you name it, interest payments, everything, we find that there's a net amount of $2 trillion a year moving from the global South to the global North. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about extraction of wealth from the global South. On top of it, there's an extraction in terms of brain drain. There's an extraction in terms of actual extraction of real natural resources. It's an abusive global system, and it's unsustainable politically, socially, economically, ecologically. This system will break and is already breaking down. And this is not new. This has been going on for decades. So if we meet again in 5 or 10 years and talk about this, if we're not addressing the structures that we're dealing with today, that number will be $5 trillion, maybe $10 trillion worth of extraction from the global South. So this is what we're talking about. If we continue with the same mechanisms, the extraction will continue. So we're talking about rebalancing the global economy in a different way. And it can't be done through charity. We're not asking for charity because this is abuse. So if you slow down the abuse, it's still abuse. If you give back a little bit and say, oh, we're helping you here, it's still abusive, it's still extractive. No, we're talking about completely repairing the broken structures. And that's why in some of my recent work, I've been calling for colonial reparations, for climate reparations in the sense of transferring of actual monetary resources, but also transfer of technology so that we can address the global economic crisis, so that we can address the climate crisis, because the climate crisis is not just happening in the West, it's actually happening in the global South too. And there is no way for the global South to address these challenges under the current conditions. So we have to figure out a different ways to rebalance the global economy, to rebalance the ecological system that we've destroyed for centuries now.
That's great.
I would add also that this system is really shocking because generally people think that the global North is helping in the global South in terms of aid, etc. So we are helping you, but those governments are corrupt. That's why they do not use well the foreign aid, etc. That could be true that you might find governments who are corrupt, etc. That's true. But the fact, as Fadhel said, we are in a really vicious system. Whereby the global South, except China, is transferring on net terms biophysical resources, meaning energy, land, and commodities. At the same time, the global South, except China, is also transferring net amount of money to the global North. And for example, when the global South transfers US dollars to the global North, the global South is not issuing the US dollars. So how can it be that the global South transfers more resources than it receives, and at the same time transfers more money than it receives? There are just two conditions: permanent state of indebtedness and selling off of assets. That's how the current system works. And that's why you would see sometimes, it doesn't work in some developing countries. Just to take the case of Senegal, recently we have renewed the fishing agreements with the European Union. And those fishing agreements, they are really beneficial to the European Union. Why? Because they have the equipments, they have the boats, etc., they could outcompete our fishermen, because our fishermen, they do not have the, let's say, the right equipment, so they do not go to the sea up to a certain point. And now what is happening is that fish is something which is in the dishes of many Senegalese. Yeah. And now the price of fish is increasing. Why? Because most of the fish is taken by European boats. And now Senegalese fishermen, they could no longer have the fish. So they no longer have an income. So what they are doing, they have converted themselves into people facilitating the illegal migration of people, because they earn much more helping people go to Europe illegally than doing their own activities. And recently, according to the International Organization of Migration, at least 400 people died in the sea. Most of them are our compatriots. But during the same week, they renewed those agreements. So you could see with this example how this global system works. We take your resources, we oblige you to be indebted to pay us back the money, and at the same time, there is no free movement of labor, you see, because your domestic labor has no opportunity to work due to these neoliberal and extractivist policies. So through this example, you could see, but every time the response is military. Now Spain has spent military people in order to make sure that there will no boats departing from Senegal to go to the EU borders, you see.
Can I add to my neoclassical response to this to give you a solution? So
yes,
if you want cheap fish, Ndongo, the central bank needs to raise interest rates so that you completely kill off domestic investment. And then if Senegalese people want more fish, they can import frozen fish from Europe, right? And then more military aid will come to the government of Senegal through, perpetual loans, so that you fight the cross-border trafficking of people moving to Europe. These are the solutions. These are the traps that are being presented. And we didn't even mention the ecological implications of bigger trailing, boats coming from Europe to destroy the ecosystem locally. That's another form of extraction.
Right. I would, neoclassical economics is just, growth. But we live in a finite, with finite resources. And so inevitably, just straight up isn't going to keep working forever. Right. And so it has to be some sort of cyclical, sustainable, supportive model. Another thing I just want to add, being kind of refugee resettlement work, talking about economic instability and what you're talking about, economic migrants. The reason we even have to say economic migrants is because, economics is not one of the 5 factors that allows you to be an international refugee and receive that status, even though, as we've talked about, the U.S. is responsible for undermining economic sovereignty across the globe. But yet, and when those people want to move, talk about movement of free labor, and they're unable to, I find it interesting that even at an international level, the UN sets the definition of what a refugee is, and economic conditions is not one of the factors that constitutes what a refugee is. And so I think we have to kind of keep that in mind, especially as we've seen economic instability throughout our history, but it's definitely something we need to keep in mind when we see countries destabilize economically. What were the factors that led to it, and what are the effects of that?
And climate change induced economic instability now is also not part of the UN definition.
Exactly.
And we're certainly seeing more climate refugees that are not labeled as such.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what countries, economic sovereignty is all about is essentially a basic decency of being able to, take care of your own citizens. Because you talked about military interference. What happens if Tunisia or these countries say, IMF, I don't care about, these neoclassical rules. I understand, I see behind the veil, what happens to these countries?
Well, there are legal principles in international law that can be used to push back against this. So in international law, there's the principle of necessity, there's principle of impossibility. All of these legal concepts can be used to allow a country to get out of an international treaty or an agreement, or to default on debt payments and things like that. There's the odious debt doctrine, which some countries have used in the past. So there's all of these legal mechanisms that can be used. But then it's one of those things where you as a country, as a small country, have to decide, do I really want to upset the European Union? And then, kind of poke the giant. Do I really want to upset the US and embarrass them that they've supported a dictator, for example, for 30 years, and now say, well, you've given all that military aid to a dictator who abused his own people, and now you want us to pay for that debt? So there's all of these tools that are available that most countries, even post-dictatorship in a democratic setting, internally within the parliament, there will be a discussion, well, we can cancel like $1.5 billion worth of debt. But to do that, we're going to have to embarrass our European friends and say you supported a dictator. But then the next day we need them because we need foreign direct investment from them. We need tourism from them. So that's not the right way to build partnership with them. Right? So these are the kinds of realities that need to be exposed. There's plenty of tools. There's just this geopolitical imbalance, which is reinforced by this myth that says developing countries need help. They need aid. They're dependent on Europe and the US and the global north. Otherwise, we're doomed. And what this framework that we're introducing with the MMT lens, it says there's plenty of solutions in terms of developing and reclaiming your economic and monetary sovereignty space. Because if you have more economic sovereignty, then you can push back against the World Bank and the IMF. Then you can push back and use some of those legal terms. So for example, the odious debt doctrine, which has been around for more than 100 years now, essentially says if a country borrowed money and the money didn't benefit the people, a dictatorship, in other words. If the money was borrowed without the consent of the people in a non-democratic society, and most importantly, number three, if the lenders knew about it, in other words, you knew that the money was going to a dictatorship regime, then if you have those three conditions, the debt should be canceled. And any country can do that. But then do you want to embarrass the lenders if it's the US or if it's the UK or if it's France? Well, that's a big question, right? So where are the cases where we've seen this principle applied? It was after the Iraq invasion. Iraq had a lot of debt from Eastern European countries during the 90s. Well, it was James Baker who flew all over Eastern Europe and canceled all of those debts. They said, well, you lent money to a dictator without the consent of the people, and you knew about it. So Iraq is not going to pay you back. So you have to have the James Baker of the US fly around and cancel your debt. But if the lender happens to be James Baker or his government, then that's not going to happen, right? So there's plenty of these tools under international law that allow developing countries to remove that pressure that suffocates their economies. They just happen to carry a lot of geopolitical consequences under the current system.
Yeah, I would say, I'm not an expert in this area, but if you guys could talk about a little bit with what happened with Libya, because I think that what we're talking about now, it wasn't that long ago that the U.S. decides to go into a lot of countries, but, just a few years ago decided to go into Libya. And could you talk about the economic ramifications and kind of, in the U.S., Gaddafi is painted as a, atrocious person. And of course, yes, there are, terrible things that every government engages in. But in terms of economic benefits to the people, there was a lot of call for debt cancellation and universal services to Libyans. And that seemed to go against the grain of what we're talking about, the neoclassical, like you're not following the prescriptions that we've set out for your country. So yeah, if you could go into that Libya story a little bit more.
Yeah, there is some paradox concerning so-called authoritarian regimes. That's why the concept of authoritarian regime is not really interesting, because you could have different type of authoritarian regimes. There are some types which are much more economically sovereign than others. For example, you take Libya. It's the only African country who could have, let's say, reach all the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, before Gaddafi was overthrown and killed, etc. Because it was one of the most developed country in Africa. The same thing with Iraq. Iraq under Saddam was a terrible regime politically, for human rights, etc. But economically, it was one of the most, let's say, developed. You would see also the educational levels were really high, despite it was a dictatorship, etc. So we have to make a distinction between, let's say, so-called authoritarian regimes. At the same time, we have also to make a distinction between, let's say, dictatorships or authoritarian regimes, and also the dictatorship of the global market. The dictatorship of the global market is something invisible. And generally, our morality has been shaped so that we are much more or less willing to criticize the dictatorships we could see, and sometimes we are so silent about the dictatorships of the global market. For example, in Africa, you have many countries which are conceived as democracies, and they could be conceived as democracies like Senegal. We never had a coup, and the elections are done in a transparent way, etc. But there is such a kind of level of economic violence due to the way we are inserted in the global economy, but no one would see that as a kind of a dictatorship of the global market. So they will say Senegal is a good country because human rights are rather respected, etc. But it's fine. But you see, many people do not have access to basic services. For example, water. And yet they say it's a democracy. But you would go in other countries where you would find people who are authoritarian, etc., but they have all the basic services, you see. So for me, economic sovereignty does not correlate with the formal political status. And we have to be much more critical about so-called democracies in the global south, which sometimes stick to the agenda of the international financial institutions. And what is sad is that more and more our leaders came from the international financial institutions. It's a way of saying these guys are legitimate, they speak our language, and they know what to do. And they can have the consent of their people. So sometimes you might have the impression that the elections are organized just to make people not go to the street, to have a minimum of consent, which could be, let's say, compatible with the demands of the invisible and of the global market. So this is also an aspect we have to think about. It's not because countries are formally considered as democracies that they are doing their best to ensure that they have some domestic space and also working for economic and monetary sovereignty. Many so-called democracies in Africa are not working for economic and monetary sovereignty. Their legitimacy is based on mostly on following the agenda of the donors. And this is, for example, the case of Senegal. I would say that we are kind of a colony, not a colony of a given imperial power, but a colony for the world economy, despite that we are called a democracy.
Yeah. So in terms of African sovereignty, you guys have touched on other ways. You know, you can't just declare economic sovereignty. You have to have systems built of sovereignty. You have to be sustainable in various aspects. You talk about agriculture and food and energy. And so what are the things that you've seen in the African continent that are being done to move towards being sovereign and trying to push out external entities? And I imagine, you know, is there a lot of uphill battle creating these sustainable infrastructures because we know that many African countries, their infrastructure was built specifically for exportation. You know, the roads go from where the resources are to the ports. And, you know, this has been developed since slavery and whatnot. And so what are the, you know, the revolutions that are taking place on the continent to be sovereign in any area, you know, agriculture, food, energy? What are you seeing?
So I can talk a little bit about some of the obstacles to these transitions. So I can't say, with confidence that these revolutions and transformations are happening, but the aspirations and the need for these transformations is definitely expressed by the people. And what we're trying to do with this open letter, in a sense, is to bring a coherent framework that says, let's pull our resources and our thinking together to transform policy in the right direction. So, for example, in the space of food sovereignty or energy sovereignty, if we have in a country a particular group of farmers, of climate activists who say we want to invest more in sustainable agriculture, and we want to develop more food sovereignty so we don't have to import as much rice or wheat or corn or whatever, guess who's going to be opposing these new decisions? It's going to be the individual or groups of individuals who have the exclusive import license for wheat for that particular country. Why would I want to develop a domestic industry that competes with my exclusive power to dominate the entire economy? So what would I do? I would, fund research by, academic economists to say that it's inefficient to do this, that this is a waste of resources, that this will be a burden on, consumers in terms of higher prices, to justify the reason of my existence, in other words. And that's the nice way of doing it. Not so nice way of doing it is going to politicians and making sure that those, approaches are not being subsidized, they're not being supported by the government, or impose even more restrictions on them in terms of not having access to land or water or loans or financing to develop that. And if you go to even nastier approach, which does happen in some countries, it's the use of direct violence against those individuals, right? And this is, I'm using this example, kind of the classic example of one entity that's the exclusive importer. But if we bring in the layer of food trafficking across borders, and now we have armed police and military in charge of a market system with, armed thugs all over the country to defend the market power of the food trafficking system, then we're talking about real violence against anybody who's trying to build an alternative, because that's going to displace you. So these are the real challenges. And what we're saying in our approach is saying, you have to focus on the root causes of the problem. You can't just, continue with the same perpetual system and say, let's do it better, but it's still the same system. Let's do it with democracy as opposed to dictatorship. Doing the same abusive thing with dictatorship or with democracy is still abusive, right? So we're saying the whole thing needs to be undone. It's not just about elections. It's not just about transparency. Those things are important. We want democracy. We want transparency, but we also want to undo the extractive, abusive structures. And I think that's going to be the big challenge for us, is to bring this message not just to politicians, not just to the academic economists, but to bring this to the labor movement, to the peasants' movements, to the ecological movement, to the grassroots, because these are the forces that will unseat MPs and presidents and prime ministers. These are the forces that will push back against the extractive system. And at the current moment, the vast majority of well-intentioned labor people and activists all over the world are still convinced that we need tourism in order to improve our economy, that we need foreign direct investment. And that's just the worst scenario you can have, is where the progressive forces who truly want to improve quality of life and address these changes, those forces are themselves convinced that there is no alternative, that it has to be done via the extractive mode. It's just, let's do extraction with better labor rights. Let's do extraction with better environmental rights, which is understandable, but it's still extraction at the end of the day.
Thank you. That was a force of words, very articulate. Thank you. I want to, because speak with so much passion, and you need to leave soon. And Ndongo, you able to stay on for some until what? You're still able to stay on? Your mic is muted.
You're on mute, Ndongo.
I can stay on, let's say 15 minutes after 4.
Yeah,
It's
right.
open.
Okay. So Fadhel, because we've talked so much, substance or facts and figures about the state of affairs, I'd love to hear if you could share your personal story before you leave. Speak with so much passion. You've been doing this for a long time. What got you into this work, and what continues to drive you? What is your why, if you could share?
Thank you. Well, a lot of these things come from personal experience, as they say, and motivation. And this is pre-economics profession. So I was born in Saudi Arabia, actually. My mother is Saudi. My father was an immigrant worker there. So I was born an immigrant to begin with, because I can never become a Saudi citizen, even though I was born there and my mother there, because of immigration rules there. And I moved to Tunisia when I was 9 or 10 years old, so completely shifted education system and culture and so on. So I was in Saudi Arabia. I was never a Saudi citizen, or always perceived as an immigrant. And then I moved to Tunisia at the age of 9 or 10, and I'm also perceived as this kid who came from another country. And then I moved to the U.S., where I'm actually another form of immigrant. So I understand that experience. And I from an early age, I understood that, this patriotic tone that a lot of people are kind of fed, from an early age, was just a foreign thing to me, because it wasn't my experience. But I understand it because I have cousins from both countries who are very patriotic and who go through the educational system and kind of fully embrace, the language of the state. And then much later, obviously, I learned where that comes from the post-colonial kind of creation of national identity and so on. So that's a very influential sort of early experience. The other experience has to do with economic conditions. So, growing up in Saudi Arabia, we had decent quality of life, middle-class status, and then all of a sudden everything flipped when my father lost his immigration status, lost his job. So we have to move back to Tunisia, and now we're dropping from middle-class status to unemployment for a number of years. So that was an early wake-up call in terms of how things can change. Just because you lose your immigration status, you lose a job for no fault of your own, and now you're stuck in an economic situation where there's no employment opportunities and so on. That lasted for a few years, thankfully, and then my father found a decent job again. So we were back to a decent middle-class status, and that lasted for a few years until probably the late 90s. And then something happened, again, through no fault of your own. This has to do, actually, my father worked for a Libyan company at the time. So when the Libyan embargo started, the whole situation exploded, and he lost his job again. So I was maybe a teenager. I was maybe 17 or 18 or something like that. And from that day on to this day, my father's retired now. He was never able to find another full-time job. It was odd jobs here and there. My father speaks 4 languages fluently. My father has an MBA, has academic degrees and long work experience in Europe and other parts of the world. All of that doesn't matter, right? And when you live in an economic system that doesn't provide economic opportunities. And my father, for a long time, refused to engage in business or work that involves corrupt principles, that involves paying bribes. And he paid for that price with his career. And we're going through that as the system in Tunisia is getting more corrupt, as the dictatorship of the Ben Ali regime is becoming more oligarchical and abusive. So that didn't help. So I've seen all of these things from an early age. My father was involved in international trade as part of his business. So from an early age, I understood the power of individuals who have exclusive import power, exclusive export power. So I've known these things before I studied economics, and I kind of put them together. And much later, after I learned MMT, actually, I started putting these things together as trying to looking at, what are the obstacles to economic development. And then I went to college and started studying economics, which for the first 3 years didn't make a lot of sense because I was exposed to all of these interesting ideas, including Keynesian ideas and regulation school ideas and kind of heterodox ideas and a little bit of Marx, like lightly. But all of it was just this jumble of ideas that didn't make any sense until the senior year when I took that course, History of Economic Thought, which was the equivalent of this filing cabinet of ideas that completely organized, everything that I learned before that was completely mixed together. And that was the motivation for me to pursue economics in a serious way. I mean, I pursued it in college because it was the degree that was offered, and I just happened to enroll in that program, and it kind of made sense. But then I knew that I have a passion for this thing. And I knew that I wanted to learn more about these alternative ideas, not the mainstream ideas. So I moved to the US at the University of Missouri, Kansas City for a master's degree and then eventually a PhD. And that's where, in one of those classes, I had to read Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which was yet another much larger filing cabinet of ideas that allowed me to kind of organize my thoughts about how to transform, the way we think philosophically beyond a particular discipline. And then, as I say, the rest is history. When I was at UMKC, that's when I was introduced to the early MMT ideas with Randy Ray and Matt Forstater and Stephanie Kelton. But most importantly, with Jan Kregel, who is one of the leading post-Keynesian economists in the field of economic development in particular, because he worked for a long time at UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development. So with his work, I was able to dive deeper into alternative approaches to economic development. So it was that whole package of personal experiences, lived experiences, and academic exposure to alternative ideas, critical thinking, that allows me to put these things together in the way that I'm doing it today. And I have to acknowledge that none of the ideas that I presented today or that I present in any of my work are actually new. I'm just putting things together and rearranging things in what I think will be an impactful way. So with full credit to everybody who's contributed to all of these experiences, including my family.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think it's amazing. You had all of these personal experiences, different iterations of, being considered an immigrant in your father's business. But it's interesting, like you see all of these things that are happening around you, but you can't quite name them or understand them until finally you're shown, okay, this is this theory of thought, or these are, what you're seeing is because of these economic principles. And I think that's so valuable and so validating, especially when you are searching for these questions, why is life like this? Is this all that there is? This can't be. And so to say all this to say that I think what you guys are doing is so important, is shedding light. Like, look, despite, all that you've heard from mainstream media, like there is an alternative that explains, or, to get us out of this mess. And there are reasons why we're in the state of affairs that we're in. I think validating people's concerns is incredibly important. Particularly, whatever country you grew up in, you're fed all kinds of propaganda for why the state is. And then when you actually are able to go beyond that curtain and see why the state of the affairs is the way it is, it's incredibly empowering. So thank you so much again for contributing to Contrarian Humanitarian and all the work that you do. Before you leave us, do you have some, where can everybody find you? What are your links? How can people, get on board with MMT, learn more about it, and learn more about you?
Well, thank you again for the invitation. I mean, I'm going to stay on to listen to Ndongo's answer as well. But I also would invite everybody to engage with us on the African Economic and Monetary Sovereignty website to sign the letter. It's mes-africa.org, and there'll be a link in the description. I work at Denison University here in Ohio, so you should be able to find my email on the economics department's website. I also run the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, which is a public policy think tank that engages in a lot of these ideas. And I'd invite everybody to find the work of MMT economists beyond just my small network. So follow the work of Stephanie Kelton, Randy Ray, our colleagues at the Levy Economics Institute as well, and lots of resources on social media, lots of grassroots organizations in Europe and Australia and the US and other parts of the world who are taking the MMT lens and applying it in their own region, in their own countries. So find a group like Real Progressives, a group like GIMS in the UK, lots of podcasts who are engaging in discussions like this one, the MMT podcast, Macro and Cheese, and Money on the Left, which is also part of the Modern Money Network here in the US. I'm probably forgetting a lot of other great resources, but there's this wonderful website called wecanhaveniceThings.org, I think, or .com, which lists a bunch of all of these academic and non-academic resources for anybody who's interested in MMT. There's plenty of resources, and you can find us on Twitter. A lot of the MMT economists are very active on Twitter.
Nice. Thank you so much. So, Ndongo, what is your raison d'etre?
Did not hear you very well. Excuse me.
What is your raison d'etre for doing this work?
Okay.
Your personal story.
My personal story. I would say that first I am a Senegalese citizen. So I stayed in Senegal until I had my baccalaureate. And from there, I went to France to do my university studies. And I have to say, I have been really curious every time I try to, let's say, to push forward the boundary of what I know. Because in my own conception, we are all ignorant. We only know 0.0001%. And every time I can read things which could, let's say, give me less ignorance. Yeah, I appreciate that. That's why I try to read any kind of literature in economics and in other social sciences. And I had done my studies in Senegal in a very good school with a very good reputation. And normally we enter that school through a contest, national contest, and the best are selected. So I lived far from my parents. The schools was in St. Louis, and my parents were in Dakar. So I would only come to my house during, let's say, Christmas, etc. And at the end of the year. So we are trained like military people. Because we have the uniforms and so on.
Wow.
And, we woke up every day at 6 in the morning to run, etc. And
discipline
like that. With rigorous military discipline. And I think that gave me a sense of organization. But at the same time, I was a little bit rebellious mind. So I could not, let's say, bring So when I had my baccalaureate, I had the option of embracing a military career. I had a scholarship to go to France to do my studies in the most renowned military schools in France, but I declined. And I told that to the people who were responsible at the Senegalese, let's say, at Senegal's army level, because it was decided at that stage. I went there. I was, I think 70 years old, and I told them I'm not interested in a military career because, that would be a straitjacket for me. And they told me, young man, you're crazy. You don't know what you want to do, because in 6 years you'll be a lieutenant, and before the end of your career you'll become a general. You see, I say, I'm not really interested, because I have many things to do, and things, and if I am a military, that that would not work, and I don't like the uniform. So let me go at the university. And they put pressure on my father because I did not have, let's say, the legal age to decline, but he supported me. He supported me. I did not have any scholarship at the university, despite I deserved one because I had a good notes, etc. So at that time there was a lot of corruption, and those who were awarded scholarship are those who had the links with the, let's say, the political class, etc. So I went to the university, but with no regret, and I was supported by my father, who is a journalist and also a lover of the Arabic language. So he was one of the first journalists formed in the Arabic language, and so he know all the Arab world, and he had many anecdotes about that. He was really a lover of the Arabic world. And so, one of the reasons also why I declined having a military career is that I am a player of Scrabble.
Really?
Scrabble, yeah. And I told myself I have to be a world champion. So if I am in a military career, I will never become a world champion because I will not have the time. And so, it was somehow a bet, and this bet was successful in 2000. In 2000, I had my first title of world champion of French-speaking Scrabble. First, and now I have four titles. And I'm not longer playing maybe once per year, but that's the point. So generally, how it happens is that you take the dictionary, and you learn all the words, 2 letters to 9 letters. And if you wake me up at 3 in the morning and you tell me, can you create a word with letters in disorder? Normally in 5 seconds, I could find all the solutions, etc. We are trained like robots, you see. And so that was one of the reasons. And and also I did not regret because I always find that we have to live a free life. That means being free, having our own choices, and be able to do what we want to do. My basic philosophy is that there is no convincing argument for inequality between people, etc. No one should govern any other people. If we let someone govern us, it has to be, let's say, structured by very precise rules. That's my philosophy. Nobody should govern any other. So inequality could not be justified. And in the army, it's let's say hierarchy. They could give you bad orders, but you have to follow it because it's hierarchy. So you have to suppress your own rational judgment. And this was also one of the reasons, because I am too committed to equality and to freedom to embrace such a career. I do not criticize those who embrace such kind of career, but given my own taste and my own philosophy, I want to have let's say a free life and also anonymous life, because having the possibility to work freely, do whatever you want to do with your family, is also a kind of freedom. And economics help to that end, because the world is structured by, let's say, economic logic. So you have to understand it in order to be able to propose solutions that could make, let's say, everybody live better. So when I encountered economics, it was really fascinating. And I read a lot of different things, heterodox things, neoclassical things, Marxism, and very different things in social sciences. So every time I try to discover new things that will help me be less ignorant. So it was this curiosity which made me discover MMT 3 years ago, and I'm really happy to have come across this kind of lands, because it's really it brought me a lot intellectually, and also it brought me friends like Fadhel and other people. I was invited at the MMT conference last year, and I've found there many good friends, many good people committed. And that is what is important, because we could have our differences, cultural differences, but nonetheless, what unites us is much more fundamental than those differences. And
Right.
we live in a period where we need solidarity between people to change things, because we know that those who rule us everywhere, they have the same interests as, let's say, as dominant people. So if we, the people, we do not unite in order to contest their political power, we are going to suffer. So we have not to play their game, let them divide us, but we have to be in a solidarity approach, so that we'll be able to challenge their power and to evolve into really democratic spaces. So
Right.
that's really my way of seeing things, and that's also one reason why I devoted some parts of my time to study the evolution of the world democracy, because I have always been, let's say, troubled by this concept, how it has been manipulated, etc. And at the beginning, it was a really very fundamental concept and very positive concept, because it meant that the people who are not, let's say, the most educated, the people who are generally the richest one, those have to decide. That was the meaning of democracy originally. And I think this idea is really important, and it could only materialize through knowing that it's not natural that one people govern others. And in Aristotle, you could find this when he says that the principle of democracy is to govern today and the next day to be governed, because it's not natural that one people govern another. So the only rule that is acceptable is the rotation of political power. But this is not the kind of thing we could find ordinarily, even in so-called democracies, because those who are in power, they always stay in power until their death. So we have to find the intellectual resources, and also build the networks, build the solidarity movements in order to contest, let's say, hierarchical forms, domination structures.
Thank you. Yeah. I think what's so beautiful about your story is that in your drive for personal freedom to do what you wanted to do, you're also trying to give those freedoms to countries and to people, because you recognize how important that is. And I think particularly like someone from the United States, we're fed a lot of freedom propaganda, freedom, autonomy. These are the most important things, and there is so much importance to those. But we need to recognize that everybody wants these same freedoms, and there are ways for people to obtain them, but we need to fundamentally shift the systems that have been governing us. You know, one quote that kind of keeps popping up in my head when we're talking about neoclassical institutions and policies is that Albert Einstein quote, where I'll paraphrase, but he says, like, insanity is doing the same thing over again and expecting different results. I think that kind of sums up why we need to introduce new solutions, because we all see that what is happening around us is not working. And we all, I think, have this yearning for these personal freedoms. So, Fadhel, do you need to pop off, or are you?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you again for this opportunity, and I wanted to wish you great success with this podcast series. It's the mission and purpose and the focus is really what we need more of. So thank you for hosting us today, and I'm happy to engage in further conversations in the future. And it's a pleasure again to see my friend
Yes.
Ndongo
Thank you so
on the
much.
show today.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, hopefully we can do this again, because there's so much to talk about it. I still have, so many questions, so many things. But yes, thank you for donating your time to us. Everybody, please follow Dr. Fadhel Kaboub on all the platforms and learn more about MMT. So thank you so much. And hopefully we'll see you again soon, or talk to you soon.
Thank you very much.
I will see you soon.
Okay.
Oh, wait. Okay. Wait, I was saying, Ndongo, you're still staying on, right?
Well, I have just wanted to
3
say
minutes.
thank you for this opportunity. It was really good to have this conversation with you, both of you and Fadhel. And I wish you great success for this podcast and for your individual work. So we'll be available next time for conversation.
Awesome. Well, yeah, like I said, we'd love to continue this conversation because there's so much depth here. But thank you again for supporting us. And everybody, please follow Dr. Ndongo Samba. Is it Sylla?
Sylla, my family name, yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Because for whatever reason, 2 L's in Spanish is like a Y sound. So at first when I read your name, even though I knew that you weren't Spanish, I said Sylla and Dr. Sylla, but then I was like, no, that's not correct. So thank you for clarifying. And thank you so much for all of your hard work and your passions. Everybody, please follow you and learn more about MMT, and hopefully we will have another conversation soon.
Thank you very much, and keep safe.
Yes, you too.
Thank you. Take care. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of the episode. There's like 5 people watching.
Oh,
Nobody's
really?
commented anything. They may not be signed in. So if anybody wants to say hi or like ask a question,
Yeah.
I'll give you maybe like a minute, and then I gotta pee. And we'll be after.
Are you seeing any? Are you looking on Facebook or YouTube?
It's in our streaming program, but the comments would come in through YouTube.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you to all the people that are tuning in and all the people that will watch this. This is our first episode. We've said this so many times, but I can't state it enough how grateful we are. How grateful I am to Mikey for being master producer and supporting us in this endeavor. And thank you again to Dr. Kaboub and Dr. Sylla for coming on and sharing what MMT is all about, and giving economics breakdown. Oh, I see a comment coming in. Okay, that's exciting. Sorry, just we're doing it. Okay. But yeah, please continue to follow their work. It's so important, and learn more about these neoclassical ideas and how they govern really essentially everything that we do, and to keep questioning why our material situation is the way it is. Do research into, again, why it is, how it can change. MMT, I think, is a great option. And again, something, economic transitions are definitely something to consider. As they said, it's not just economic. There's a lot of things that are a part of sovereignty. But the economics really underpins a lot of what we do, and particularly, I've said this, in humanitarian assistance. Because if countries were sovereign and were able to develop in the ways they saw fit and be self-sufficient, then a lot of humanitarian work wouldn't be needed. So we have to question the state of affairs and why things are the way they are, and find solutions for change and put those forward. So we're happy we could share MMT with you all today, and hopefully we'll have more conversations about that in the future. So, yeah, anything, Mikey, you want to say?
Just thanks to the few people who actually watched the live stream on very short notice. Shout out to Alexander Leopold for commenting. And that's all. I mean, I thought it went really well, other than getting a little rocky start to the technical issues, but we got it worked out. And now I have to pee because it's been 2.5 hours. So.
Yeah. Cheers, everybody, and
Cheers.
happy holidays.
Later.
Bye.